On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by two very talented guests. For the first half of the show, I will be talking with Renn about the decline of American cities and whether or not these cities are beyond saving. We'll also discuss some of Aaron's work on masculinity within the church if we get to it. And then for the second half of the show, I will be joined by the Renaissance of Men to expand upon this topic as well as talk about the death of the Manosphere. As I already mentioned, I am joined today by Renn. So, Aaron, please tell the audience who you are and what you do.
Thanks for having me on. I have done three things over the course of my life professionally. I started off in the first career as a management consultant and spent 15 years or so working for a firm now known as Accenture. And then I transitioned to become a policy analyst looking at cities and urban policy. And I spent several years as a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York. I still do some of that, but then I transitioned again, really focusing more on men's issues in the future of the evangelical church, because I saw that so many men were turning to, again, the Jordan Petersons. You mentioned the Manosphere. I'd been following the Manosphere a decade or more. And, that's what really I saw initially, all the young men turning to that. And it was kind of hard to articulate to people the rise of the men's gurus. But then as people like Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate came along, much easier now. Why aren't they turning to the church or to traditional authority figures, institutions? So really engaging on that question and sort of the general future of the evangelical church. But I'm still very much do engage on urban policy, state and local policy as well. I should mention, you should subscribe to my newsletter at aaronrenn.com, AARONRENN.com, and that lets you keep up with all my work.
Excellent. Well, glad to have you. We'll go ahead and start with your work regarding cities and urban development and specifically the health of cities. So first of all, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you've done in this area and how this became your passion?
Sure. I grew up in rural Southern Indiana, and so had a deep Indiana connection, and then started my career in consulting in Chicago. What I really saw was sort of the Midwestern cities, the Rust Belt cities, if you will, got no love. Nobody paid any attention to this area of the country. And to the extent that there was discussion about cities in America and what they should be, everything was relative to a coastal benchmark. And especially back in the day, Portland was the city everyone wanted to be like. Every city in the Midwest, except maybe Chicago, their leaders were afraid that their young people all wanted to move to Portland and sip lattes by the light rail. Now, of course, the bloom was off the rose in the city of roses, as it were. But the point was that nobody was really thinking about the Midwest on its own terms. And so I just took the same tools, techniques, and disciplines that I used to help advise major corporations on navigating business and technology change to helping Midwestern cities, adapt and try to recover from sort of the malaise in which they found themselves. And so that was really my entree into cities. I really didn't think the Midwest got any love. I was a Midwest guy. So I wanted to do that. And then, from there, I really got into it. And then the other thing that really, probably before the writing aspect of it, that got me interested in cities is that I grew up in a town of about 50 people in rural Southern Indiana. I grew up 4 miles away from a town that was a 4-way stop. For a while, I lived in a trailer on a gravel road. And then after college, I moved to Chicago, one of the biggest cities in the country. And I fell in love. And as someone once said, Aaron, you love cities like only somebody from a town of 50 people can. And so coming from the country, I discovered I was a city guy. Although I still love the country and I love the rural areas, I love living in the city.
Yeah, I love the city as well. And it makes me sad to see so many of the things that keep popping up on Twitter and just the news cycle all about the health of those cities. So one of those big stories of this last week or so was the man by the name of Jordan Neely was in the news after a video emerged of him being held in a chokehold by bystanders who had restrained Neely after he was described as making threats. So there's been a whole lot of reactions to that whole story as a whole, but what was your initial reaction to that?
I didn't pay a huge amount of attention to it Undoubtedly, we have seen in recent years a dramatic increase in the number of sort of homeless people, mentally ill in the cities, and essentially sort of an ideology that says, that they can do whatever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, to whomever they want. And these are disturbed people that need help, and they should have our sympathies, but they're not getting any help.
Mm.
And, there's an army of these advocates who are ready to file lawsuits at the drop of a hat if you try to, like, for example, make them get treatment or follow their treatment plan. And so we've seen this, kind of happening in every city. And, you've in the kind of the, kind of post pandemic world, we've also seen that this is intersected with increases in crime in these cities. Now, everyone will be quick to say crime in places like New York are far below the early 90s peak, which is true. It's really important to keep in mind that crime declined a lot from, say, the crack wars era of the early 90s. And even after, a recent increase, it's really still much lower. On the other hand, in New York, you went from ultra safe on the subways to not quite so safe. I mean, there was, a number of, it used to be on average when maybe one or nobody killed on the subways. Now we're in double digits every year. People killed on the subway, people pushed onto the tracks by schizophrenic people, assaults, different types of, violent disputes, all of that sort of thing happens. And then, of course, you see this thing happen. And this is what you see in the city. Of course, the activists go crazy and they want this, Marine who put this person in a chokehold, to basically be executed and all of that. And these are the same people who are totally indifferent to essentially all the other murders that have occurred and all the other crime. And if you try to, even the transit activists, it's really been depressing to watch what has happened to the transit activist community. I'm a believer in public transit and in, walking and bicycling and in safe streets. And there really used to be a great group of advocates who were very focused on that issue. And they were sort of, I call them single issue voters in a sense. It's like, yeah, just because you're a liberal Democrat doesn't mean you get a pass if something, if you're not implementing good policies on transport. If you're a Republican and you do something, we'll tell you it was non-ideological. It was really focused on making things better. And then sort of around the time of George Floyd, this movement more or less became just another standard issue, liberal kind of, activist groups. They're totally aligned with all the ideologies. And so they're, it's like, oh, crime's on the subway is not a problem. Crime's on the subway is not a problem. Everything's safe. Don't worry. Kind of poo-pooing that. And then, of course, they go crazy over this one. So we see how selective everything is. We see that essentially policing, we see that prosecutions, we see that concern over public order becomes incredibly politically driven. It's less about justice, less about public order, less about public safety, and more about that. And so I think what I would say is the risk level in cities has definitely gone up. They're still incredibly safe. I think in a lot of ways, the stereotypes of you're going to get killed if you go to Chicago, it's just not true. So within the last couple of months, I've been in New York a couple times. I was in Chicago over Easter. I've been to Washington, D.C. These cities are, they got challenges and we could talk more about them, but in fact, they're not hellholes. And in Chicago was looking fantastic when I was up there. Not to take away from its problems, but the average person is not necessarily feeling terrorized when they walk out of their house. At the same time, what we see is the risk level has gone up, and the risk level has gone up in a number of dimensions. Risk one, yes, it is more likely that you will be a victim of a crime in these cities. Number two, if you actually defend yourself against a criminal in any way, you're at risk of being prosecuted. So we're essentially going towards a much more of a, call it the anarcho tyranny type of solution, where kind of the criminal class is coddled and allowed to just get arrested and time again, no bail. That's one of the things that happened in New York. They eliminated cash bail basically unless you kill somebody. Pretty much, you're not, you're going to be just released immediately. And but if you do anything, there, I mean, we saw that with the Kyle Rittenhouse thing in Kenosha. Right. We saw it with this guy down in Austin. We're going to, we'll see what happens with this guy in New York. But basically, they're going to drop the hammer on you, there. So, if there's the risk that you will fall foul and find yourself the, victim of a targeted sort of political prosecution. And then there's the what I call the ideological risk, where even if you are like right down the rails progressive, you could easily find yourself be the victim of a hate mob and get fired, lose your job, all that stuff. And so, I think that the risk calculus has changed a little bit. Call it incrementally. It's just a riskier place it's riskier to be involved in civic life in these cities because you could, fall afoul of these activists. It's riskier to walk down the street. It's, riskier to defend yourself if you're attacked. And so I do think that has happened, although it hasn't killed them yet. And then, what I would also say is, especially with these subway attacks, when something is, when something is essentially viewed as impossible, which is, I think when I lived in New York City, from 2000, the end of 2014 to the end of very end of 2019, the idea that you would get attacked on the subway was essentially, mentally speaking, it was impossible. It was impossible. I'll get killed on the subway.
Interesting.
I rode the subway I come home from Washington on the late train, gets in like 2:30 in the morning, Penn Station, take the subway home. It's full of people. There might be some homeless people in there sleeping, but you never felt like, oh, I'm going to get killed. I never felt any sense of danger. But then you see that this guy from Goldman Sachs gets killed. You see this person shoved on the tracks and killed. You see these things happen. And all of a sudden in people's mind, it's gone from impossible to possible. And even if the possible is remote, the fact that it is now mentally conceivable that you might get killed on the subway, whereas before it wasn't before, I think does change the psychology of people when it comes to the city. So I think there are a lot of kind of negative trends in the city, I would say. Ideological trends, homelessness trends, mental illness trends, economic. We should talk about economics too. And those are definitely a negative. They're definitely increasing the risk. However, American cities are still very great in a lot of ways, particularly for people who live there. And so I am not predicting an imminent collapse of the city, certainly not of places like New York, which have so much going for them.
Well, that's good. It's definitely encouraging to hear your optimism on that because we do see such negative news. Like you mentioned how you went to Chicago recently, and Chicago is really not that bad. But obviously one of the big things that we saw when it comes to Chicago in recent news was that Chicago teen takeover. So what kind of goes through your mind when you see those instances, since obviously you're an advocate and you're very optimistic about the city. So what do those kind of news cycles do to you?
Well, certainly Chicago has acquired a negative international reputation for crime that goes back a decade or more. And, it's kind of become a byword for crime internationally, and things like that certainly affect the city's reputation and what people think. I believe that occurred downtown. I spent time out in the neighborhoods, and I think what you see in a lot of these cities is sort of the residential neighborhoods are in much better shape than the central business districts. The central business districts have been very hurt by sort of remote work. Where they basically the places were ghost town during COVID. Then the retail environment has been hit, both because there's been a lot of transitions in the in the retail business, and then again also because of this hands-off approach to crime, where essentially professional organized gangs of people who commit shoplifting are just allowed to go wild. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the videos of people, walking into a Walgreens in San Francisco and just casually stuffing a black garbage bag full of merchandise and walking out, and nobody stops them. so now you got the retail things, and so I do think that the perceptions around downtown are definitely worse in a lot of places, and the downtown is very critical to these cities in terms of their tax base, because so much of the tax base of some of these cities is based on essentially taxing workers. The property taxes on skyscrapers in Midtown Manhattan, Chicago Loop, is based on their ability to lease them for a very high rate and thus have very high property values, and which are I say collapsing, but they're going down. And so we see that. And so yeah, the things like these teen takeovers, they happen. And I would distinguish between different of these events. Some of these, I think they call them sideshows,
Mm.
where you'll see people, go on Lower Wacker or somewhere, and they'll steal their cars. Well, they'll start doing donuts on the car and like doing all stuff like that. And I look at something like that and I say, that's not totally dissimilar to what I remember growing up in rural Indiana, where people would do, burn tires in the four-way stop, and they'd, maybe do a little, drag racing or do some donuts. That's kind of, it's a little bit of a boys will be boys thing.
Mhm.
Obviously, you shouldn't be doing stuff like that. It's dangerous. But it's not, an inherently malicious activity. Whereas, in this little teen takeover, there's sort of a mix of some of that, what I would call, basic juvenile behavior, but also, some assaults of people. So there's an article about some, people from, I live in Indianapolis now. So people from Indianapolis were up in Chicago visiting. Their car got smashed up. Obviously, they're very traumatized by it. And yeah, people see that stuff and they say, do I really want to go there? And it does affect the psychology.
Yeah.
Here in Indianapolis, the local business paper did a reader survey. They did a huge special issue about the future downtown, and their reader survey was not a scientific survey, but these are mostly higher income people, but you would say people who are also very civically minded and that sort of stuff. And what they basically found is among suburbanites, 73% of people had a negative perception of downtown. Of people who lived in the city, in and around downtown, it was much, much lower. They had a very positive view of downtown. And so I do think we've, a lot of people like to talk about regionalism as being very important, and that, cities and suburbs and entire regions really need to work collaboratively in order to compete with other regions. And there's a lot to that. But in some extent, I think we've a little bit reached peak regionalism, as I think there's kind of a growing kind of disconnect between the suburbs and the city. I think people in the suburbs who put a very high premium on, safety and low crime and things like that, they see this stuff and they're like, I don't want to really go down to my office. I don't want to pay to park. And so, they're disengaging. And even here in Indianapolis, where I would say, the suburban people have been extraordinarily supportive and proud of our downtown and how we've transformed it. Now there are people who just basically like, I don't really go down there anymore. And that's not healthy. And so I do think that these sorts of things, they certainly have an effect. They certainly have an effect. And again, I think one of the things that has an effect on people is when the actual leaders in these communities don't seem to care.
Right.
And, you'll have somebody, make a tweet like, hey, I just saw this thing on Megan. I can't remember the exact city it was. It's somebody who is, taking the train. This mother, she's like, wouldn't it be nice if I could take my 4-month-old on the train and not have to have people smoking there? Why don't they do more enforcement to keep people from smoking on the train? Right before I left New York, I started seeing people just openly smoking pot in subway cars. It's kind of crazy. It's like you go to the cities, and that's another one. It's like pot smoke everywhere. You can't escape it. And she gets attacked. It's like, how dare you want all this, police state stuff. It's like, anybody who wants a little law and order is basically treated as a neo-Nazi. And, so you see the mayors of these places acting like this is no big deal, or just making excuses. And you say, wait a minute, it's not just that there's problems. It's that the people who run these places don't want to do anything about the problems. They're sort of
Right.
ideologically invested in not doing anything about the problem. And then sort of call it the mainstream sort of civic constituencies, the business community and people like that. They're just silent, because I think one of the characteristics of sort of American leadership today is everybody's sort of terrified of the mob. It's very kind of candidly cowardly. People don't like to speak up. If you speak up, you're going to get attacked. Most people don't want to be attacked. And so, I think that this idea, this is one thing I just say, you know, is there a constituency in the cities who really wants to seriously address these problems? In some places there are, it's more livelier debate than others, but I think you look at it, there's a very large constituency of people in the cities who don't want to do anything. I was just reading the Daily Mail today, and it was about how homeless encampments have taken over Portland. I'm sure they're exaggerating, although there are a ton of homeless encampments in Portland, and you could make very impressive videos. And certainly the West Coast, it's far worse than it is in the Midwest.
Right.
I was stunned the last time I was in Palo Alto, the amount of like campers and things. Just like, what the heck? This is supposed to be like a rich suburb, and like there's essentially homeless people in every street. But it's like Portland. There's all these encampments. People in the city, feeling unsafe. And these are all very liberal people for the most part, but they're like, I actually don't feel safe walking out of my house anymore. And now there's like these Democratic lawmakers who want to pass a law that officially gives sanction to all these people camping out, and in fact would have $1,000 fine for anyone harassing them or telling them they need to move on. So this is the whole anarcho tyranny that happens. Like, we're going to punish you if you even so much as tell these people they should stop camping in your front yard. You're going to get the $1,000 fine. They are, and so this sort of complete inversion of, sane societal values is what you see. And, unsurprising, I think when people see that, I think everybody knows homelessness is a hard problem. Okay. Mental illness, these are hard problems. These are not problems that you can flip the switch or maybe just throw a little more money at them and solve them. And I think people are willing to give some grace to folks on hard problems if they're serious. And the people running our cities are basically not serious. Even though a lot of our mayors themselves are not ideologues, they certainly give tremendous deference to the ideologues. And, it's not healthy. And again, I'm not predicting imminent doom for cities. I think people who are counting on Chicago collapsing, all these people collapsing, I would certainly not bet on that. It's interesting. I'm probably one of the more optimistic people these days. I've noticed when it comes to like Chicago. 5 years ago, people would have said, Aaron, you're one of the most pessimistic people. Now I'm one of the most optimistic people, even though my position actually hasn't changed in 5 years, but the sentiment has shifted. But nevertheless, I think people look at that and like, we're out. And we have seen, demographic reversals. We've seen, again, a population exodus out of these cities. It's been very well documented. Right. Migration, population loss. Again, I think some of that was in fact pandemic driven. If you're in a New York apartment and the pandemic hits, you want to go out to your place in Connecticut, nice single family home. You want to go someplace with space. You want to go someplace where you can do whatever. Some of it was that, some of it was pandemic. The cities had the worst shutdowns. People didn't want to live like that, so they got out. I think, the George Floyd riots didn't help. And so, you see these things. And I do think, that there's a little bit of a bounce back, but it hasn't fully bounced back. I mean, there's definitely been a shift in kind of the balance of power, the center of gravity towards the suburbs. Not a mass abandonment, but, city advocates who want to claim, the sun is always shining should, take some of these things a little more seriously than they do.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it does seem to be a lot of the more liberal politicians that are in the leadership positions that tend to have that apathy, or at least are maybe captured by the ideology of their party.
Well, there's to me, I don't want to give the Republicans a pass. I think the Republican Party, I criticize Republicans all day long too. I'm not impressed with the Republican Party. I don't think that they're serious about governing. And they've got a lot of their own ideological issues as well. It just so happens that they don't actually run the cities for the most part,
Right.
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 And,
Exactly. And I
it,
wouldn't give them a pass either. They're definitely there's a lot of work to be done there. And that's why I try to make the distinction that I'm more conservative in my principles as opposed to identifying as Republican for that very reason. So I was going to ask you though, what kind of inroads do you think that a more conservative, economically, socially type of politician can make in some of these cities, and just leadership in general that are wanting to kind of make some positive inroads in some of these places like Chicago, that, as you said, are maybe not as dramatic as the news makes it out to be, but still have plenty of problems that need to be addressed?
yeah, I'm not seeing like sort of any conservative resurgence, in these places anytime soon. Um, the demographics have shifted in ways that are, super favorable to Democrats. When I lived, Rudy Giuliani, Republican, won a couple terms as mayor in New York. And one time I went to an event and a Republican city councilor was speaking, and he's like, the people who voted for Giuliani are in one of two places. They're either in Florida or they're in the cemetery.
Mm,
And that's the reality. That old kind of, a lot of that old kind of middle class, constituency is gone. The cities are much, much more heavily minority. Even cities that you think of, lily white, like Indianapolis, actually 47% minority. And, realistically, almost every minority group is presently voting Democrat.
mm,
Cubans, there's a few here and there that vote Republican. And obviously, of course, we've seen that Hispanics have been shifting towards the Republican direction. So I don't know that it's inevitable that will happen. But right now, it's sort of in a structural environment that's favorable to Democrats. Again, many more kind of young, single, educated people. The heartland of the kind of the Republican vote is sort of married families, right?
right.
That sort of thing is the exact sort of thing. It's like if conveniently, if you look at like every policy Democrats support in some way either benefits their sort of electoral demographic base or is designed to hurt sort of the Republican electoral
Right.
demographic base. And that's why you look at a place like San Francisco, which famously has more dogs than kids and which has the lowest percentage of people under the age of 18 of any city in the country, and certainly any major city of the country, in the city of San Francisco. That's not a place that's going to, be, shifting in a more conservative direction, anytime soon. And I just think that, as currently construed, sort of conservative politicians and things don't really have a lot to offer. I say this all the time. It's like, Ronald Reagan said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Right.
Well, people in the city, when the fire department shows up and says, we're here to help, they're actually quite glad to see the fire department.
Mm,
They're actually
yeah.
quite glad to see the police department when they call 911. They actually like parks. They actually like taking their kids to the library. They like trash pickup. The local government does things that people want. And the Republicans that had success in the 90s, like Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis or Giuliani in New York, these are people who had what I call a positive governing agenda.
Mm,
The Republican Party today in America does not have a positive governing agenda. That's not to say that all Republicans don't. I actually just moved to the suburbs. I never really truly lived in a full-on suburb,
mm,
before. Like, it's my first experience with it, but it's been run by Republicans basically forever. The Democrats are making inroads and just is sort of more educated suburbs kind of trend blue. But we've had a phenomenal mayor for 28 years. He's not running for reelection, and he took a lot of flack because he borrowed 1.4 billion dollars to like make this place world class, and it is.
mm,
And people like that. I mean, ultimately, he's been very popular and just kept getting reelected. And even in the most recent election, both the Democrat and the Republican candidate are like, we need to stay the course on this. So we've got here in my town a Republican political class or Republican Party that has said we want to have like very nice streets that are paved and well maintained. We want great parks. We want to have a phenomenal library. we want to have, trails, and we want to have walkable districts in our towns and things like that. And if you just go on down like, oh, our water company, we're the only people in the entire region that if there's sort of a drought, we don't have to put water restrictions because we've actually
Mm.
invested in treatment capacity. And, we've spent some money, but we got something.
Right.
And I think that sort of, maybe that not that exact agenda would work everywhere, but if you don't have a positive governing agenda, it's going to be harder to get a hearing in the local levels. And so I think certainly suburban Republicans can, and it's also they're going to have to be comfortable, I think, in a more moderate social position.
Right.
I don't think the suburbs are at all interested in hardcore left ideology either. Quite the opposite. You see in places like Loudoun County, Virginia, solid Biden country. He got over 60% of the vote there in 2020. Parent revolts against a lot of these ideologies in the schools. They're not down with that stuff.
Right.
And so I don't think that the Democratic ideology sells, which is why the Democrat who's running for mayor of my town is like the international man of mystery. He doesn't want to say, he's very vague about what, extraordinarily vague. I don't think he has like one policy idea. I just want to move our community forward. Well, what the heck does that mean specifically?
Right.
He doesn't want to talk about that. But anyhow, in the cities, maybe there will be, some, but I think it's more likely that they'll vote in sort of a more moderate to centrist, sort of neoliberal Democrat than a Republican, to be quite honest.
Gotcha.
I just don't see it right now, and that's not to say that it's going to be true forever, but right now things don't look good.
So one theory that I've seen a lot of is the idea that cities really encourage people to be more liberal in their ideology. A lot of that, one of the theories that I've heard at least, is a lot of that has to do with being renters as opposed to owners. So one of the ideas that I've seen thrown around is putting like height restrictions on buildings to sort of encourage outward expansion as opposed to upward expansion. So what is your thoughts on that?
Well, one thing I'd say is, a lot of cities are not exactly full of apartment buildings. New York City shapes so much about what we think a city ought to be. You come to the average city in the Midwest, it is overwhelmingly single family homes. So, yes, in places like Chicago, New York, a lot of people rent. But this idea of cities as being places that are just renters is not necessarily true in a lot of places. There's very high home ownership rates in a lot of cities. The height restrictions. I think one of the things that really has hurt cities. And again, is this a bug or a feature from the standpoint of the people running it? We can debate that. Is they have put a large number of restrictions on what you can build, and I think there's a growing consensus that our sort of real estate planning and planning and zoning has become so convoluted and so restrictive that it makes it hard to build new housing. And as a result, prices have gone up a lot because prices are about supply and demand. And when you make it very difficult to expand supply, anytime there's a hit in demand, a spike in demand, it's going to send the prices soaring. And so that's what we've seen in some of these places. It's virtually impossible to build in a place like San Francisco. And so I would say height restrictions are those types of sort of like zoning regulations that probably on net don't help. Now, the one place that has a height restriction is Washington, D.C. Nothing can be taller than the Capitol or something like that. And so there's a lot of talk about eliminating that. I don't really care if they eliminate it or not. I would say that whether it goes up or out is probably not going to affect the demographic makeup or kind of the political or other orientations of the city. And one of the things that's really hurting conservatives right now is that essentially conservatism is, and really Trump really hit the accelerator on this, candidly, is becoming essentially a low status movement. It's essentially, a movement that's associated with very unhealthy, overweight white people who are on disability, and are not in very good health, don't have college degrees, in very decayed communities. And the left is very much the high status option. So this is why you see people who are college educated trending very strongly towards kind of the left option. And so, and as you know, and this is where kind of the Republican idea, well, we need to embrace the idea of being a working class party. Well, working class is low status, and you definitely have to deliver something for your followers. And if that's your followers, you got to deliver something for them. But the Democrats have figured out how to give goodies to their coalitions while creating an essentially high status movement. And it's very difficult when you get to this the situation where you've essentially embraced the low status model. It's going to be hard to that becomes hard. It becomes sort of a a self-reinforcing, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement cycle, however you want to say it. But I think that's it's very, very complex. I can't even begin to unpack it here, but I do think that kind of the status difference between being on the left and being on the right is enormous. And as a result, that certainly plays, especially in cities, into that. And of course, like as I said, in the cities, it's actually an actively hostile environment towards conservatives in some ways. When I lived in downtown Indianapolis, when the George Floyd killing happened, this donut shop in my neighborhood apparently didn't put up a Black Lives Matter sign or didn't make some post on social media. So a group of activists contacted them and said, "We noticed that you haven't put up any Black Lives Matter statement yet. Why haven't you done that?" And they declined to do it. And they were like tarred as racist. They came after them. There were entire Instagram accounts devoted to trashing them. The local newspaper trashed them, and they were essentially run out of business. And again, if that had been a gay-owned donut shop that got even one negative tweet directed their direction, the Chamber of Commerce would have been out there. The mayor would have been out there. Everybody would have been out there saying this is unacceptable in our community. But it's very acceptable to all of those entities to essentially run conservatives out of business, attack them. And, and so this is just the reality. You add to that beyond just the status differentiator that like it's an actively hostile environment to anybody who's, not on the left or even the far left. And that's just reality. And, again, the institutions, the people who run it, the business community, let's just say it, be honest, the Fortune 500 community is fine with that. They haven't done anything. They haven't said anything. And so de facto, they're okay with that. And so that's what ends up happening. Not that they per se approve of it, but, they won't do anything about it. And so these are the sorts of things that you have to consider as you decide, where to move. And I personally, I say I'm a city guy. I love living in center cities. And, there's a lot of different things that feed into our moving out to the suburbs. But one of them is simply as a very public figure with heterodox views. It's probably not a good idea to be living around the corner from that donut shop that got like trashed by all these activists and like in a neighborhood that's like, particularly here in Indy, where it's like not really progressive. These are the classic Hick Libs, right? They're sort of like, they're kind of hayseeds themselves, and they're really trying harder. They try too hard because they want people to really think. It's like the people who aren't really in the club always, dress the part a little bit more than the people who are already in it. And so that creates a, kind of unique unpleasantness, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's absolutely a social factor there that comes into play.
Right. It was wonderful living on the Upper West Side of New York, and I would live there again, but I don't want to be living surrounded by a bunch of Hick Lib types because they know the words but not the music. Let me put it that way.
Right. So I know we only have a few more minutes with you. So I wanted to just pick your brain with the remaining few minutes of what you think that the church can do in inner cities that doesn't just necessarily enable the problems, but actually begins to move to solve those issues.
Well, churches of all varieties have really been on the front lines of, working with urban problems, homelessness ministries. Again, here in Indianapolis, the biggest, homelessness organizations are faith-based. They're religiously run. They do a ton to help, kids who are in these, I hate to use the word, it's like a cliche, underprivileged communities. They're doing a ton to help ex-offenders. And so I think that's all positive. And I don't think it even comes down to, per se, your theology on this, that, or the other thing. I think this is one of the things that, almost all of the Christian traditions are united around, whether it be the extremely conservative, Pentecostal church I was raised in rural Southern Indiana, which is, running halfway houses and doing prison ministries and helping opioids, or the liberal mainline church in town who's doing the exact same thing. And so I do think that, this is one where churches do engage. Now, of course, in the cities, there are, different kind of, call it political kind of positions from the churches. To the extent that churches are involved politically, they're invariably on the left in these urban centers. But they're hardly the the main instigators, let's just say, of negativity. They're sort of, again, religion, Christianity has become low status in America. And as a result, even kind of the liberal Christians and the mainline churches are just followers. They don't lead, they just do what everybody else is doing. So they're kind of just Me Too, if you will. It's like, the kind of the progressive left says Black Lives Matter, and they say, yeah, we're going to put the Black Lives Matter one on our church. They're not, they're not the source of anything. And
Right.
so I do believe churches do tremendous good works in the cities, and that's really important, particularly for people who have, when you're dealing with a problem like, substance abuse, or you're homeless, or you're coming out of prison. It's good to get benefits from the government, and that's needed in many cases. But the reality is, you got big personal problems. It's not going to get solved through a bureaucracy. You really need people to come alongside you and work with you sort of as a person every day. It takes, it does in many respects take a work of God and the Holy Spirit to save people from these things. And so the prayers and different things are definitely effective. And so, I think churches do tremendous good works, in the cities. And I think they're again, can they solve homelessness on their own? No, but they're certainly part of the solution. And of course, that does vary, kind of by place. And in a place like New York, my impression is this sort of progressive, non-religious nonprofits kind of, have a lock on most of that stuff. But in a lot of other cities, there's a ton of faith-based stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of an encouraging note to end on, is the idea that there's at least some unity when it comes to inner city presence from the church on both sides of the
Right.
war.
I mean, everybody agrees that you gotta, you have to do things for the poor. For example,
Right.
it's like basically it's like Christianity 101. No, that's not the gospel per se, but that's like, it's like, it just kind of known. It's been in the DNA of the church since the very beginning, and recorded in the New Testament, in fact. And so that continues to today.
Excellent. And we will continue to hopefully press on in those good works. But Aaron, I really appreciate all your time tonight. It's been a lot of fun talking all about cities, and you've left me feeling a little more optimistic.
Right.
So I appreciate that. Where can people go to continue to follow everything you're doing?
Again, sign up for my newsletter at aaronrenn.com, AARONRENN.com. And you can follow me on Twitter. It's at Aaron_Renn. So give me a follow there too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Aaron. I look forward to having you on some other time.
Thanks for having me.
All righty, everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed your time listening to Aaron. We're actually going to be bringing on Will Spencer from the Renaissance of Men podcast. He is joining in last minute. For those of you who are wondering, Michael is taking a couple weeks break. He is in the middle of some really heavy finals in his seminary. So so last minute, Will was willing to join in. So I'm going to go ahead and bring him on here. Will, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much for joining us. So can you go ahead and tell the audience, for those who are not yet familiar with you, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm the host of the Renaissance of Men podcast, which is documenting the 40-year rebirth of masculinity that's happening around the world. which is now culminating in a global rebirth of Christianity amongst men and women, leading towards a great reconciliation of the sexes and triumphing over feminism and many of the men's movements that are dragging men off the path of actually becoming husbands and fathers and leaders.
Awesome. Well, there's a lot there to unpack, and we're definitely going to unpack a lot of that. But I wanted to kind of kick off our conversation with a tweet that you actually put out regarding the Manosphere. So I want to go ahead and just first of all, can you go ahead and give the audience, for those who are maybe not familiar with the term Manosphere, like a little bit of a running definition of what that is?
Yeah. So the Manosphere is, it's as the name implied. It applies a sphere. It's an online space of men to get together and discuss different aspects of masculinity. And in the case of the Manosphere, they frame masculinity not as what men are for, but what men do. So men do hard things, men make money, men sleep with women, stuff like that. So men get in shape. This is what a man looks like. This is what a man does. And so the Manosphere is an online virtual space, not any one location, but it kind of grew up in social media between Twitter and YouTube for the most part. Also Reddit and other forums to discuss the sort of things that men do. And it's been around for, I don't know, maybe say 15 years, something like that. It's kind of grown in size and influence over that time, and yeah, we'll go from there. I guess we'll leave it there. It's grown from size and influence, but it's having some challenges right now, let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, we'll talk through those challenges. So you tweeted just a little while ago, you said the Manosphere is dead and the Manosphere killed it. The Renaissance of Men is here for all men and women looking for a better way forward. And with that, you posted a couple of different screenshots of tweets from some of the guys that consider themselves to be very much thought leaders in that space. So one of them was Rollo Tomasi, which I will say I'm not very familiar with his work. I know that he wrote The Rational Male, but I know that he's been on a lot of different podcasts. He has his own podcast, and he's very much into influencing young men, especially trying to give them advice on how they can be successful. So he just put out this tweet that you had reposted. He said, the quickest path to becoming a high value man. So he said, 1, do not get married. 2, avoid family creation. 3, vasectomy in your 20s. 4, live consistently. 5, eliminate all sedations. 6, learn game and networking. 7, play to your strengths, build wealth. 8, resist easing up on your focus. So Will, I kind of want to just tackle this with you kind of point by point real quick here about
Sure.
why you think this is contributing to the death of the Manosphere. So the first one, do not get married. Let's start there.
Well, actually, I want to take a step back from there and say the problem of the tweet itself comes with the notion of high value man. Like the whole framing of, first of all, what does it mean to be a high value man? And I think what the implication within the tweet is that your value as a man must be established materially by your money, and by your status. And that's fundamentally a godless materialist way of looking at a man's value, because our value is not established by our bank account, or how many abs we have, our visible abs. Our value is established by God. And unless you root your value as a man there, then everything crumbles from there. And you can see the results of this godless worldview in his prescriptions for men after that. So the problem is yes with the individual, I think 7 things, but the problem begins at the very foundations of what he's talking about with evaluating men's value. So and everything building from that just ends up being an evolving disaster. But now we can start getting into the individual points.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. That's a great foundation to start with, because you are correct with that. So that first point is do not get married. So let's go ahead and start there.
Yeah. So becoming a high value man. So what he's essentially saying is the quickest path to becoming a man worth a lot of money is not to get married. Now, I'm not sure what the statistics say, but I'm pretty sure they say that men who get married actually end up earning more than men who than men who don't.
Absolutely.
Because the process of being responsible for a family, growing a family, providing resources creates a drive that singledom just can't. So, if you want to build wealth, don't get married. Like, the tragedy, again, it's reflected in the worldview. It's just like, make a lot of money. Congratulations, you're a high value man because you made a lot of money. It's like, is there nothing else? Is there nothing else to us? Is there nothing else to us but the size of our bank account? And if you think that, then don't get married because wife and kids are expensive. But if you're looking at a wife and kids, if you're looking at women in terms of like a family, in terms of its financial cost to you, you are no better than a liberal. I was just listening to Renn, and respectfully, like Renn, I have great appreciation for his work. I think he's wrong about a lot of things in what he said, and maybe someday he and I will get a chance to talk about that. But I lived in San Francisco for 15 years. I lived in the Bay Area for 20 years. There, and he mentioned, I think he mentioned that in San Francisco, people have more dogs than kids. The reason why that's the case is because a lot of liberals look at family creation and say, it's so expensive. I want to be a dink. I don't know if you know that term, dual income, no kids.
Income, no kids. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Why? Well, they don't want to have constraints on their free time, but in the actual conversation with liberals who live in these cities, like, oh, it's so expensive to have kids. And so in the same way, you have Rollo Tomassi saying, if you want to make a lot of money, don't have kids, evaluating the love of a family purely in material terms. So right off the bat, like, the gun goes off at the starting line of the race of this tweet, and he falls flat on his face.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I didn't get to talk about with Aaron is the fact that San Francisco has an entire department just dedicated to cleaning up feces on the on the sidewalk, and there's a map that you can look up to see where the most recent feces dump has been laid. So that's obviously a bunny trail that we can't chase, but
well, who says? I say I'm the host.
The rest of the podcast will be all dedicated to San Francisco. So, so number 2 here, avoid family creation. So obviously this is of a similar vein, but if there's anything that you want to expand upon, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, so avoid family creation. So, why is avoid family creation separate from do not get married? Why are those two separate things, right? Shouldn't you only be creating a family when you're married? What he's trying to say is, don't get a woman pregnant, is what he's saying. Avoid. He's trying to frame it in some sort of values-based kind of way, but avoid family creation. He's saying, like, don't get chicks pregnant, because, like, if you're not getting married, if you follow step 1, you're not married. So what are you doing to create a family if you're not married? That's accidental. You're getting a girl pregnant, is what he's saying there. And so you can see immediately we go into like, well, don't get married.
If there's any doubt, he jumps right off the cliff with number 3.
Exactly. Well, exactly. But just real quick, if there's any doubt about his worldview, like, don't get married, but he's not saying don't have sex, right? He's saying don't get married, but keep having sex, but be careful and don't get her pregnant. And again, like you said, now we go into number 3. The best way to do that, if you're going to be fornicating, is get a vasectomy. And I was going to send a tweet today. By the way, it's really funny. Twitter locked me out of my account today for 12 hours. That's the first time that's happened to me, because I made a joke about someone, like, I don't know if you saw the tweet going around where this guy was saying, if you really want to test if a woman loves you, break up with her for 30 days and see what happens. Did you see that?
I did not.
Oh, yeah. So this tweet went, all these Manosphere dudes are just like, they have to get more and more extreme in order to get traction because their worldview is so bankrupt. But this guy said, his name is Eric Weiss, I think. He said, if you really want to test whether she's the one and a woman loves you, break up with her for 30 days and see what happens. And so the whole internet went nuts, and on that, the Twitter went nuts. And I commented on someone's observation, someone saying, do not do this. I commented saying, if you really want to see how much you love oxygen, try to drown yourself and see what happens. And Twitter locked me out for encouraging violence.
Oh, so
no. So I've got another 6 hours or so on my temporary ban, because their AI engine doesn't detect irony, apparently.
And Susie Q in the chat said, if you want to test if a woman loves you, ask her to marry her. I think you meant marry you, but yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think what this guy on Twitter was saying was that before you do that, before you ask a woman to marry you, to find out if she really loves you, break up with her for 30 days. And it's like, this is what passes for advice, with godless men. Unfortunately.
Now, there's a lot of guys obviously that are a part of the Manosphere, and some people are considered a part of it, whether they want it to be or not. Some don't affiliate it with it, but I have not seen too many people pushing the idea of intentionally sterilizing yourself. Have you seen other people aside from Rolo doing that?
No, I haven't. And honestly, like that, so that number 3 point is what really it smashed the Overton window for dialogue about masculinity. Right.
Yeah.
Like, so you can find guys who say, don't get married, live consistency, build wealth, all those things. Okay, that's fine. Don't get married, avoid family creation. Like, okay, that's not the end of the world to say something like that, or because at least someone would be able to interpret it, avoid family creation until the right time, right? Okay, fine. No one would have thought twice about it. But that he said, get a vasectomy in your 20s. Now, there's a couple different dimensions to this that are really troubling. One, of course, is that a vasectomy is you're taking a scalpel to your junk, right? That's what you're doing, right? People say, well, it's reversible. Like one of my friends he was married. He was done having kids. He got a vasectomy and he had serious side effects for like 2 to 3 months. He was really scared for a while about what was going to happen. So this is not a consequence-free procedure. It's also not the data on reversing it is also not good, right? And then you have to take a scalpel to your junk again to get it reversed. So like, even if you're proposing this as a valuable solution, like, don't get married, avoid family creation, take a scalpel to your junk twice. Like, come on. And people were saying maybe it's satire. Like, no way. You don't bury your satire that deep in a list of otherwise legitimate kind of things. So and then Rollo defended the tweet on a live stream the next day, I think with just pearly things. I don't know if that video ended up going up. A friend was watching it and said it turned into a disaster. So I don't know if that interview ever came out, but it wasn't satire. And again, you see the bankruptcy of the godless ideology of the Manosphere, which is like, don't get married, avoid family creation, don't get a girl pregnant, but still have sex, have lots of sex. And the best way that you can have lots of consequence-free sex and still an enjoyable consequence-free sex, let's say, is through getting a vasectomy, right? Because because that's the thing about the Manosphere that isn't really well understood, is that the Manosphere came out of the pickup artist era, which was the late 90s and the early 2000s. So you had all these men going into nightclubs, bars and nightclubs, running game on girls and having one-night stands. And they found all this information about women that stood in contrast to the feminist dogma in the mainstream media. It was out of that era that the Manosphere grew out of that era. Pure promiscuity, fornication, exploitation of their own bodies and of women's bodies. That was the ground that the Manosphere sprang out of. Undeniably so. And this is when I talk about the Renaissance of men, this is something that I've been studying for the past 5 or 10 years, just to understand how we got to this moment. And so that's where the Manosphere comes from. So you can see that the way that the ideology carries forward, like, oh yeah, no, continue having lots of sex, consequence-free sex. Don't give that up. That's how you be a high value man. And you see they see the logical extremes that it goes to, because the pickup artist era would say, always control the birth is what they said. That was their guideline, which is like, don't let a woman saying that she's on the pill, don't take her word for it, right? You make sure that you're the one responsible for using protection and don't trust her. So if you want to have lots of quote unquote consequence-free sex, no such thing, consequence-free sex with women while you're attempting to be a high value man, if your concern is pregnancy, get a vasectomy, right? And so again, and we'll talk about why I said this means the Manosphere is dead. It's like the level of absurdity, the level of pure godless, inhuman absurdity. And like, we're on point number 3. We've already revealed the flaws between the thinking of what it means to be a high value man, the materialist conception of a family, don't get girls pregnant, but have lots of sex and castrate yourself. Right. That's why that tweet exploded. Matt Walsh retweeted it. Ben Shapiro retweeted it. It's all the kind of bad publicity. People say there's no such thing as bad publicity.
There is.
There is. I
There
disagree.
is.
I disagree. Yeah, exactly.
Michaela in the chat said, "This is not satire. This is his playbook, and it's creepy."
Yeah.
And then Susie Q said, "That's not being a man. That's childish behavior." So, two women in the chat both don't agree with this. So,
Yeah.
I can't say I'm surprised by that. Now, the other points, I'll pull it back up here. The other points are a little bit more, a little bit less controversial, but I would say it really boils down to the definition, like live consistently. My immediate thought is, what does consistently mean to you? Is it to the point where you are shelving all your other responsibility, or is that something where you just mean to be consistent, having like a morning workout routine, something that's healthy? Same with eliminate all sedations. I would say that really depends upon what you're going to define, what that definition looks like to you, as well as game and networking. There's maybe a healthy way of having some healthy game as a young single man looking for a good godly woman, as well as playing to your strengths, build wealth, resist easing up on your focus. Like those are fine goals depending upon how you define them, but ultimately the worldview that we've already flushed out from the beginning of the first 3 points really sets the stage for why those remaining points are obviously not being viewed in a healthy lens already.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, live consistency, eliminate all sedations, learn. Like if you just posted 4 through 8, no one would have cared. We've been hearing, and men say those things, and there's a healthy way to approach those things and an unhealthy way to approach those things. But again, what's missing from this? Any amount of moral cultivation, any amount of spiritual cultivation. No, go to church or read great literature, learn an art, play a team sport, right? There's nothing in here to present a well-rounded image of a man at all. In fact, it's all about make money and build wealth. Build and build your network, right? Your network is your net worth. So build money and build a network and get in shape. It's purely materialist. There's no conception of, yes, I just saw in the chat, what's missing is a person's soul. There's no notion of a man's soul in here. And so you can see that showing up in the first 3. The first 3 again are like, well, don't do anything that might take away from you making a lot of money and having fun, having casual encounters, and then just make a bunch of money. It's like, is that all we are as men? And I started out the description of the Manosphere saying the Manosphere was really good to a point of saying what men do. It is not good for saying what men are for. Right. And because it can't answer that question, because the only answer comes from God, it has to get increasingly absurd in saying what men should do to try and cover up this God-shaped hole in the middle of its ideology. And so we see it. We see it right here. Nothing that feeds a man's soul, that cultivates a man's soul, that makes him into a good man or a godly man, a high value man, is how it conceives of everything.
Absolutely. And I've had you on the podcast before, and we've talked quite a bit about just masculinity in general when we've had you on, but something that we haven't had a chance to do is to kind of give the full background on how we got to this state. So you recently have put out some stuff about the war on men. So I know it's really tempting to want to start with Adam from the very beginning,
right.
But for the sake of being a little bit more brief, can you kind of walk us through the war on men, starting with maybe like the start of the 20th century?
Okay, yes. I was going to make a joke and say, well, there's this. So God made Satan. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Right. It goes a little further back. But yes, okay. So the big shift on the war on masculinity, and again, wherever we start is relatively arbitrary. I could just as easily start with the Enlightenment of the French Revolution, which would be appropriate, but for the interest of time. So the big shift happened in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, we went from home-based economies, home-based businesses where the father was home with the mother and the children all day plying a trade, to men going to work, men, women, and children, essentially really going to work in factories. And removing the father from the home atomized the family, because the father leaves the home, the mother can't care for the home and the children at the same time. So the children go off to the public school system, and then the family is blown apart. But it didn't stop there, because when the father was removed from the home and sent to work in the factories, not long after that, we have World War I. And the reason why World War I is underappreciated in terms of its significance is that was the first time we experienced industrialized warfare, which is what we have today. And the human soul, the male human soul, was not prepared for that. And so World War I was a war with absolutely devastating consequences. I really do think, and I heard Doug Wilson say this, he thinks that the exit of God from our society, from Western civilization, began after World War I, because what men saw and experienced had so unparalleledly horrible. Is that even a word? Incomparably horrible that it really rattled people's belief in whether there could be a God after events like that. And this is where you get a lot of the guys like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald essentially being shell-shocked. And you get postmodernism, like there can't be a God with this much horror. So that aside, you have World War I and World War II. Something like 35 million soldiers died in those two wars. And who were the men that would go off to war? The men who would go off to war were the best and the brightest and the swiftest and the smartest and the most brave and noble. Those were the men who went off to war. And in industrialized warfare, you don't really have a chance to earn glory in battle in the same way that someone like Achilles would in the Iliad. You know what I mean? Right. It's not hand-to-hand, up-close, man-to-man combat. You can get blown apart by a shell out of nowhere and discover, you're not the main character, unfortunately. Yeah. And so 35 million of the best and very soulless, absolutely. So 35 million of the best and brightest men are destroyed, essentially. And then the men who come back from that, they have shell shock because they've seen and experienced and perhaps even done terrible things. And they're thrust back into modern American society just at the moment, and the real beginning of modernity too, with the industrialized home, just at the beginning of the era of mass media. And so in the late 1940s, you have the Kinsey sex study, which, starts upending a lot of traditional notions about sexuality. And there's data in the Kinsey sex study, which is worthy of an hour all on its own. Absolutely. That could only have been acquired through criminal sex acts with children. Yeah. That came out way, way later, or that was a big question that no one asked. So you have the Kinsey sex study in the early 1950s. You have Playboy magazine, right? And then you have the Beat Poets and Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan's mentor was a man named Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg later advocated for NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. So in the 1950s, you have this undercurrent of beginning to warp the sexuality of America, taking it in a more godless direction. Elvis and Marilyn Monroe were the surface manifestations of that. So as the 1950s go on and the baby boomer generation, what we now know as the baby boomer generation, begins growing, this is the environment that they're marinating in. So that when the 1960s come along, there's all this dry powder, all this kindling ready for sexual revolution. And then the Beatles came on and they lit it on fire. And so you have this enormous explosion, which is why you see these girls screaming. If you've seen those videos of girls screaming for the Beatles, that's what I think a lot of that was. And so you have the greatest generation of the men that had been at war. They don't know what's going on. This is happening under their noses. Right. And maybe they're too weak to resist. And so the baby boomer generation in Vietnam, et cetera, kicks everything in the cultural sense into high gear. And then it evolves and essentially metastasizes from there. As the baby boomers grow up, there's no cultural force with enough power to push back on the sexual revolution. Feminist theology takes over. Feminist theology is that women have been oppressed throughout all of history and women need to be liberated. And it's like it touches on the guilt and shame that live in all of us. Like, oh, maybe that's true. So maybe we should let women lead. Maybe they are victims. Okay. And feminist theology just essentially says that we should all bow the knee to women instead of to God and his word. Right. And that took hold in America and many American Christians. And fast forward the clock 50 years, what do you see? You see a feminism, a feminacy and feminism throughout the church throughout Christian men because of the weakened generations of fathers in the first half of the 20th century. So we are the inheritors of that legacy, and the church is today. And so the attempt is going to be to wind back the clock, but not to the 1950s. I was just at a conference this weekend, the Traditional Fatherhood Intensive with C.R. Wiley, Nate Spearing, and Rory Groves, and that was great guys. That was in Washington, and we were talking. I think it was me and Rory Groves. It's like, we're not winding back the clock to the 1950s. We're going back to the 1850s or the 1550s or the 5050s. You know what I mean? Where it's like, we're going back to the notion of the productive household, not where work is the domain of the father, where he goes off to the factory and the mother's at home just tending the house. Men and women being together, learning, applying a trade, starting a home-based business. That's how we are designed to be made. And that was beginning to be lost in the Industrial Revolution. And so now here we are 150 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And there's so much there to unpack, everything from the Beatles. I would really say that they were the first kind of model that became the boy band. And we saw that replicated over and over again. So that's kind of theme continued on. Everything about the world wars and just the fact that that generation got lost. Something too that I think was a big factor is the introduction of like no fault divorce, for example. As well as another thing I've heard you talk about in some of your material is the dad clown kind of character that starts cropping up into culture as well, with the Homer Simpsons and just about every major sitcom that you can think of in the kind of the 80s, 90s that was popularized. The dad's always the doofus. So I do find that interesting. And you mentioned how the church has become very effeminate. So that's something you and I had even talked about on Twitter back and forth before, is the idea that we observed that you are more of a new believer. You've been a believer for, I believe, like about 3 years now?
Coming up, less than 3 years, yeah.
And something that you and I had talked about on Twitter back and forth is the idea that I was raised in the church, and you and I observed how so many new believers tend to be the most vocal about kind of the craziness going on in the world. And I really think a lot of that has to do with when you are raised in the church, that idea of niceness is so drilled into you that to be confrontational is to be hurting your witness, and to be essentially sinning is oftentimes how whether the church outright says it or not is another thing, but that's definitely the culture that has been created in a lot of the modern evangelical American churches. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that for a moment, why you think that is.
Which part?
Just the idea that if you've been raised in the church, maybe that is your natural tendency, is to maybe be less confrontational, not necessarily be vocal about the craziness happening.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I see it is that Christian men and women get 3 doses of something that secular people only get 2 of. So a Christian man or woman is under the submission and influence of 3 different sources of cultural information. One is culture itself; you still live in the world. The second is your father, your human father, and the third is your pastor. So if effeminacy has crept into culture, which it has, if it's crept into many men's families, which it has, and it creeps into the church, which it has, Christian men and women who grow up in the church are going to get 3 doses of that, versus people who aren't in the church will only get 2. So what that does is it creates a more powerful impact, right? Because and also there's the component of like, this pastor, there's a spiritual father component, and I don't want to do anything to go against my spiritual father. So you get 3 doses, and then it's like, whoa, I don't want to rock the boat within my church, because there's commandments against that. There's, well, not commandments necessarily, but God hates those who sow discord among the brothers, right? So that's like 3 layers of shells holding people in, and it's a real problem. However, I think it's possible that there were questions that the evangelical church wasn't willing to ask I mean, Doug Wilson talks about all this, right? Why was he asking the questions for 40 years that are now just beginning to be asked now? And so I regard it as a near catastrophic failure of pastors, because really, I go to Apologia in Mesa, Arizona with Jeff Durbin and James White. Very strong emphasis on apologetics.
Yeah.
Hence the name. Like, my church is the church that shows up at abortion clinics like 5 days a week. We're out, or at strip clubs, and at the Mormon Temple, and at public events in in Arizona State University. Like, it's very strong apologetically going out and preaching the word into culture. That's part of the church. And that's what we're called to do. Go and disciple the nations. And somewhere, I don't understand where, in probably the second half of the 20th century, that spirit got lost. And I think there's probably way too many threads to unwind. But yes, there is a component, I think, of Christian men and women learning to be less nice. Learning how to thread that needle between being mean or aggressive, or imbuing your witness with something personal, because we care, anger. We don't want our personal anger to flood into our passion for the word, and that's hard, and that has to be trained. But I think it's necessary for the church to begin getting there, and I think the church, in many ways, because it was affected with effeminacy, because it bought into the feminist theology, because there was no one there saying this is what's going on, you have to be careful, or those voices were silenced, or they were bought off, or scandals. I don't yet know. It's really it's a real challenge the church will have to. It's a real challenge the church will have to face. But here's the good news. The good news is, if you get 3 doses of poison and other people get 2, you also get 3 doses of medicine and other people will get 2. And so the strength that Christian men and women can find by finding strong, devout, faithful, masculine, we might say patriarchal churches, and taking and having you can't remake who your dad was, but by being in strong masculine environments and taking in strong masculine content, the strength that comes from the inside out with the power of the gospel is unmatched by anyone else in culture. And so though on one side of things, the weakness may seem to be even greater, if you turn the dial the other way, the strength will be even greater as well. And that's what I see happening in the not too distant future.
Yeah, that's great to hear. The idea that you can have 3 doses of medicine is definitely an encouraging thought to keep in mind, especially when it does seem so bleak at times, just the state of evangelicalism in America. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some people within the church that are going to be watching this that maybe want to have a better understanding as to why the Manosphere pulls Christian men into their space as opposed to towards the church. And I think you've done a pretty good job of elaborating on that with your idea of the Renaissance of men. So can you maybe start from the beginning of the Renaissance and kind of walk us through kind of how the Renaissance began, the stages of it, and where it kind of is in current day?
Sure. So the Manosphere draws men in for the same reason that the New Age draws people in. And that's what I spent 20 years in the New Age before coming to Christ. So what the Manosphere offers is like what the New Age offers, counterfeit versions of the real thing. So the reason why the Manosphere has appeal, and I think Aaron Renn talked about this a little bit at the start of the interview, is people are drawn to Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan or whoever, because because they're made in the image of God, men that are made in the image of God, a masculine God who reveals himself as Father, and they're not finding that masculinity in the church. So they go looking for wherever it's available. In the same way, in the New Age, people are wired to seek inner healing and transformation and information about we might say the spiritual side of life, right? They're wired to seek that. They're wired to seek God, and they're not finding that given to them, particularly with holistic healing practices. They're not finding that in the church either. So they go to the people who are offering it, but there's a whole worldview tagged onto it. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So the stage of the Renaissance. So we talked about the war on masculinity, which was, Industrial Revolution, World War I, World War II, the Cultural Revolution of the 60s, and how it kind of evolved from there. So in the 1980s, a lot of men were beginning to notice that men were in sociocultural decline. Like these trends are not new. Men were feeling a sense of purposelessness, aimlessness, even back then. And there's other reasons for that as well, because America had transitioned from a producer to a consumer economy also. But men were trying to figure out in the 1980s, what's going on with men? Why are they so listless? And so this poet and author by the name of Robert Bly ran around the country doing a tour, essentially looking to Jungian psychology and indigenous forms of Native American spirituality and tribal belongings to try and resuscitate the spirit of men. He did it in a really good spirit, and it really caught on. He was not a Christian man, but he was really doing it with a positive desire to help and to heal. And so that caught fire. And his tour was called The Gathering of Men, and it was documented in a video with the famous interviewer named Bill Moyers, I think he's still alive today. So that documentary, 45 minutes, exploded. Like it was shipped. It was a VHS tape that was shipped through the mail. And finally men were seeing, this guy's talking about what it means to be a man. Something's going on. And it just exploded and went crazy. And that started what was called the mythopoetic men's movement. So myths and poetry sort of re-inspiring the male spirit. So there was a magazine called Wingspan. Again, this was printed and shipped through the mail. There were gatherings, in forests, initiations, things like that, which were really, really popular. That got viciously shamed out of existence. That became very popular and started spawning best-selling books, which brought it to the attention of the mainstream media like the New York Times, and it got viciously shamed out of existence. It was called narcissism, everything. And I actually have a friend, my friend Glenn, was a part of that time, and the author Douglas Gillette, who wrote the very famous book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. Iron John and King, Warrior, Magician, Lover are the two biggest books of that era. And Douglas Gillette said that, they didn't realize that they were doing anything wrong. They were just talking about these things, and then the New York Times landed on them, and all these men scattered, right? And they split. And so the mythopoetic men's movement kind of died, and it never quite achieved the same cultural status that it had after that point. It was viciously put down. So then in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, you had the pickup era, right, where you had all these underfathered boys led by this man named Mystery, Eric von Markovic. He was very charismatic. He had been a stage magician, and he kind of knew, that he kind of had a skill with women, with talking with them. And he discovered these techniques called game that he then monetized and marketed to other fatherless boys who were seeking the one available kind of conquest that's still permitted in our culture, which is promiscuity. All the mountains have been explored. All the bottoms of the oceans have been navigated. There's no frontier anymore. If you want to go conquer something, culture says go conquer a bunch of women, and you can do that. And so the pickup era became very popular, exploded, men selling courses and weekend trainings and stuff like that. And so you have thousands of men all over the world sleeping with, unfortunately, thousands of women, and discovering that what feminism had said about men and women was a lie. That doctrine, the pickup artist era fell apart because all of the men were ultimately not good men, right? They couldn't hold relationships or anything together. So the pickup artist era ended as it kind of fizzled out. I mean, you can still see remnants of it are available today, but then it transitioned into the Manosphere, which is like you have all these guys faking being high value men, doing stage performances at bars and stuff. What if we become high value men, again, in a purely materialistic sense? So that became very, very popular for the past 15 years, because now they're actually talking about how a man, shows up in the world. And so that's the Manosphere. But the Manosphere is ultimately godless, as we'll see if we cover the other tweet that I shared as well. It's ultimately godless. And then once COVID started coming around, men started recognizing they needed to get sovereign from the systems of economic protection, and that naturally led into Christianity. So as men are rediscovering Christianity and looking for meaning and purpose and a religion to fuel their spiritual pursuits, that they're done with materialism. So they're going towards Christ. And so that's the evolution of the Renaissance of men. And meanwhile, you have, masculinity coming into the Christian sphere. You have Christianity coming into the masculine sphere. You have masculinity coming in the Christian sphere. And now these are colliding and mixing and creating fireworks. So that's the renaissance of men, kind of in a nutshell. That 40-year process, beginning as a response to cultural conditions, and it began in the 1980s, and now it's culminating right now and moving into the next evolution with it, which is Christian masculinity.
Hmm. So you think that we are in a point where we're going to start to see the two worlds merge? Um, I know fatherhood was definitely missing from a lot of those earlier models.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think was definitely a massive loss to those earlier movements. Would you say that's a lot of why those movements did not continue to replicate?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. What I say about the Manosphere is that it's trying to solve the problem of father hunger with a lot
Mm,
of older brothers. Like
mm,
we come from a generation largely of fatherlessness. So we're trying to figure out what it means to be fathers, but we're not fathers. We're older brothers. And so what do older brothers do? Older brothers aren't good at being fathers. They're good at bullying and bossing around and shoving and like, I'm just, I'm bullying you, but it's for your own benefit, like stuff like that. That's the Manosphere. That's literally the Manosphere. But the father hunger runs much deeper than that. And so men have finally realized that they're reaching an age now where they can become and want to become fathers themselves. And so they're looking for models for that. So, and those fathers need an anchor to ground their fatherhood in. And the only anchor for that is Christ. That is, God as father. Where else are you going to root your masculinity to being a father besides the religion that identifies God as father? And so that's
mm,
what men are beginning to discover. God can solve the problem of father hunger, and strong pastors and strong communities, not older brothers. Right.
mm.
And look, I can give the Manosphere men the benefit of the doubt that they did the best they could with what they had. And I thank them for that because they made a valuable contribution to the dialogue. But what the Manosphere is not doing well at all is reacting to the change. They are like, because they can't handle it. Someone moved their cheese, and they're, if you know that expression, like, hey, things change, the dialogue evolves, and they're not responding well, and it's a tragedy to see because they did help a lot of men, and now they're just burning that all down in a suicidal rage over the change in the winds. And
Mm.
you see that in the Rollo Tomasi thing. That
Yeah.
was a big part of his tweet. It's doubling and tripling down on godless materialism, because he can't deny now that Christian men and pastors have very powerful things to say about masculinity.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got some great questions in the chat that we'll definitely get to in a moment. But I wanted to jump back to the other tweet that you shared because it kind of continues on that thread of
Yeah.
the godlessness of this movement and how they are kind of grasping at straws at this point. So this is from Manosphere President Anthony. I don't remember if there's longer to his title, Anthony. I don't remember his last name is. I'm sure you're more familiar with this
Anthony
space than I am.
Johnson.
There we go. So I know that he's another one of like the kind of thought leaders in this space, not someone I'm super familiar with his work, but you had posted his tweet that said, in case you haven't figured this out yet, Mary was a cheater. The real bio father of Jesus was just some random desert giga chad who knocked her up. Quote, oops, God did it. Then cucked Joseph. Your woo-woo cult was created by a 304. So please explain to us what is even happening in that tweet.
It's just hyper cringe. So the thing with the Manosphere is that it fractured in, I think, in 2018. I think into two camps. Anthony Johnson and Rollo Tomasi were good friends. I don't know that they were partners, but Anthony Johnson runs an event called the 21 Convention. And so Rollo Tomasi spoke there, I think, in 2017. Hundreds of men came to that event because Rollo Tomasi was very popular. This was probably the peak energy state of the Manosphere was 2017. So Rollo Tomasi came to that event. Hundreds of men showed up. It made the 21 Convention very popular. It made Rollo Tomasi very popular. And then Anthony Johnson and Rollo Tomasi had a very public falling out. Lots of accusations and counter accusations going back and forth about doxing and takeovers and all this stuff. And I'm not able to litigate what's true and not, but they fell out spectacularly and publicly all over YouTube and Twitter. Is really, really bad. Now, I've spent time in person at the homes of both Rollo Tomasi and Anthony Johnson.
Mm.
And I've tried to reconcile the two of them. I had no idea how bad it really was. So, but the Manosphere at that moment fractured in two, with some men going to follow Anthony Johnson and some men going to follow Rollo Tomasi. So if you find guys who say like, oh no, I'm not part of the Manosphere, it's like, well, maybe you probably are, because a lot of guys followed that division. So the reason why I posted Rollo and Anthony is those are the two camps, the two main camps of the Manosphere. So what's going on in that tweet? Anthony is avowedly anti-Christian. It's not just he's an atheist, because there are some atheists that are like, yeah, I'm not down with that whole Christianity thing, but you guys do you. No, he's avowedly anti-Christian. And he has done many, many tweets on this subject. He's objectivist, and he follows Ayn Rand, rational egoism, as I think is her thing, which is like, hey, if you get yours and I get mine, we can be friends. That's the whole idea behind that. So Anthony, in his hatred for Christianity, and it is hatred, posts things like that, which essentially is denying the divinity of Christ at a minimum, and essentially calling 304 means whore, HOE, Mary was a whore, woo-woo cult, all that stuff. Like, it's basically slandering Christianity at the most blasphemous and really cringe level. Like, to read that is like, why would you say that? Why would you even say that? So, and it's out of a bitter root many are defiled, and so that's kind of what you're seeing. And so, what's kind of baffling to me is that there have been in the past, I don't know if there will be in October of this year, but there have been in the past many devout, very avowedly Christian men who speak at Anthony's conference, including myself. I spoke there in 2021, and then I was spontaneously banished about a year ago out of nowhere. And so he's been attacking me, but I still to this day don't know why I've been banished. He never told me. He never replied to my tweets or emails. Whatever, that's fine. I really don't mind being banished from the Manosphere at this point. Like, thanks for doing me a favor. I appreciate it. So, but men, I hate to name names, but what's odd about this is that, Elliot Hulse, for example, has spoken there, Arthur Kwan Lee, Michael Foster. Now, these are men that I've met, and I don't know where they're at with this, but it's very odd that a man can be posting truly the most blasphemous stuff about Christ and Christianity, the mother of Christ and all of that. And where are you guys on that? But regardless, like, it's just an odd thing that's happening within Anthony Johnson himself. Like, why are you saying that about Christianity, and why are you booking these men if that's what you think they are? If you're calling, like, why would you book men for your conference if you think they're members of a woo-woo cult? How can they possibly be right about anything else if they get that so spectacularly wrong? So there's a conflict, within Anthony about this, and I pray for him. I really do, because in my evangelism that I've done with my church, Apologia, it's often the people that react the most strongly negatively to the gospel that are the closest to it. And that was something that I learned that surprised me, because, for example, my church went out to the Super Bowl. We didn't go into the Super Bowl. We were outside the Super Bowl evangelizing, because it's here in Phoenix in February. And as I'm handing out tracts, new life in Christ, like 99.9% of people are just walking past and ignoring me, like I'm not even there. Some people would make eye contact and take a tract, but other people would actually come and engage. And I was grateful to engage with those people in dialogue, because there was something in them, something alive, that was responding to stimulus. And so I look at that, and despite all of the, we might say, professional conflict that it evinces, it's like really, really praying for Anthony, especially because he's about to be a father himself. His I think his wife now is pregnant, and so she's due in July. And so I look at this, and as painful as it is, as painful as it is to be accused and slandered, and and as painful as it is to see a man actively resisting the only salvation available to his soul, I continue praying. I continue praying for him. And at the same time, in the dialogue of masculinity, this ongoing, like, what does it mean to be a man that we've been doing for the past 40 years? The answer is Christ. There is no answer outside of Christ and Christianity. And so as the dialogue is beginning to shift and evolve into this new state that truly can lead the charge against feminist theology and femininity and culture, this is where the armor of God is. The resisting of that in the dialogue is very painful and grinding of gears to watch. It will ultimately end. And I pray not in as spectacular a way as it possibly can, but this is happening. And so we're witnessing this grinding as the dialogue shifts over into a new phase, this resistance of the truth, which is what happens with the gospel. People resist the truth, but the truth will not be stopped or thwarted.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's ultimately going to lead to what you refer to as the Great Reconciliation. So before we jump into the comments to answer some of those questions, talk to us a little bit about what the Great Reconciliation is.
So the Great Reconciliation is, I discovered what I started creating content for the Renaissance of Men in September 2020, right? Just after I got baptized, believe it or not, October. And it wasn't long. I started on Instagram, and it wasn't long after I started on Instagram that I discovered that there were women talking about content for femininity at the same time, dozens of them, and they were hugely popular and successful. I was surprised, and I got to thinking about well, what could have caused that? Like, where did that come from? And I realized that the more male content creators came in, the more female content creators came in, and they sort of began to develop the synergy. And this dialogue started taking place on Instagram. And I got to thinking well, I wonder if there's some spiritual connection between what's happening with men and what's happening with women. So the idea being that like men standing up and becoming the men that they can be, claiming space, being strong and having strong backs and spines and speaking up confidently, was creating a space for women to step into and begin becoming women. Lots of female content creators on Instagram, who were former boss babes in the workplace and decided to be stay-at-home moms instead. That's a huge phenomenon. It's not really happening on Twitter. It's very much on Instagram, dozens of accounts again. And so I started thinking well, if you let's run out the numbers on this. If you create a Renaissance of men where men are rediscovering what it means to be men, and that feeds into and creates a Renaissance of women, and then the Renaissance of women feeds back into the Renaissance of men, because if you're going to be a good man and you're going to find a good woman, you're going to work even harder to be a good man. There's nothing that motivates a man more than a good woman to really achieve and succeed. So you begin getting this virtuous cycle. Well, what does that look like on a societal level? I called it the Great Reconciliation. Men and women coming back together, rediscovering themselves and each other and the household and what it means to be in loving, productive union. I call that the Great Reconciliation. And that's ultimately where I believe all this is going. And that's why I promote or talk about the Renaissance of Men. The Renaissance of Men isn't me. It's hard to communicate so much in a few words on Twitter. The Renaissance of Men is a 40-year process that's been happening, and it's culminating right now with the reconciliation of the sexes. And why I love the Renaissance of Men as an idea so much is that it puts forth a vision for what men and women can be together. It's expressing we as men and women can have this. It's not about women being empowered like feminism says. And it's not about men being empowered over women like the Manosphere says. It's a vision for us coming together that is ultimately rooted in Scripture and the Bible, where true fulfillment is found. And so that is the direction the Renaissance of Men is going, and the Renaissance of Women is going towards the Great Reconciliation. And I find this speaks to people's hearts when I tell them that, because God placed that longing in us.
Yeah, absolutely. Susie Q in the chat said, it's amazing how men being men creates room for women to be women. Yeah. And then one of the questions that we got earlier, you actually kind of began to answer. Michaela in the chat said, as a Christian, or excuse me, no, that's not the one I was thinking of. It's this one here. Will, have you noticed a shift in some of our culture that is trying to get back to what we lost, etc. Trad wife.
Yeah, I have, and I think ultimately the reason why I don't like the word trad, I mean, it's how things work. We tend to shorten things and whatever, but I think trad is limited in its scope, because if you're acting out traditional roles, you're acting. It's not real. You
Yeah,
still
great point.
have an unregenerate interior, right? So like, well, I want to be a trad wife, so I'm going to put on the sundress and run through the field, and now I'm a trad wife, and with my Chad boyfriend with the yes face. You know what I mean? Like, you're acting out a role. But regeneration in Christ and being under God's commandments to men and women creates a true transformation in the inner individual, where it's like, I'm not being trad. I'm not adapting it as a LARP. Like, this is who and what I am. This is who and what we are designed to be. This is what we can be. So insofar as someone truly desires that in their heart and repents and recognizes that the way that we have been living as a society that we inherited is godless and ungodly, and goes through the regeneration process of wanting to live in a truly godly way for the right reason, for the glory of God, I don't think that's trad. Anything short of that, they're different, can be, I'll have to think through this, but there's a LARPing component, like, oh, modernity has failed, so I'm going to LARP the trad life. It's like, well,
yeah,
maybe some people can be very sincere about it. Maybe some people can be very sincere and not approach it from a Christian foundation. But I think, and I think that there's a lot of acting. So through true regeneration of the heart, you can actually live it out peacefully instead of fighting against your inner inclination and inner training, right? And instead of living in a way counter to that. Like, you want to live from the inside out. So you have to transform the inner man and woman first.
That's good. Michaela in the chat also said, as a Christian woman, what role do I play in helping the church grow in masculinity? Is this role a silent role?
Oh man, that's a tough one. It depends. It depends on the stance of your pastor towards masculinity. But I can tell you, okay, if I expand the question a little bit out of what role can I play in my church, I would say I recommend the book, The Queen's Code by Alison Armstrong. Now, Alison Armstrong is a friend of mine. If you go to my YouTube channel /@RennOfMen, you can see the recent interview that I did with her. Now, Alison's not a Christian woman, and the book is not written from a Christian perspective, but there's so much good stuff that's very good and true. And there's nothing in there that is radically anti-Christian. Like, a couple of the girls meet in a yoga class, no big deal. I think there's some light swearing, like maybe the S word, you know what I mean? And there's a scene of premarital, not a scene. It's like a moment of premarital sex, but it's on the way to them getting married, and it serves a very essential function in the story. It's not just like telling people to casually jump into bed with each other. But that's like cumulatively like 3 pages out of 300 of really deep, heart-centric teaching for women about how to properly relate to men. It transforms women's lives and men's lives. I read it. I was like, oh, wow, I understand myself to a whole new degree. So if you want to help bring about masculinity in the church, the best thing to do is transform your relationship to men and masculinity. The best resource that I can recommend for that is The Queen's Code by Alison Armstrong. And that will help transform you from the inside out and plant a seed in the church, which has happened in my church, where there's now a friend of mine named Amber, who's leading I guess you might call it a discipleship group of 8 to 10 ladies who are all working through the Queen's Code together to reform their relationship to men. So I might recommend that as a bottom-up solution instead of like top-down, because top-down is like probably out of our pay grade.
Right. Susie Q said, adding to Michaela's question, as moms, how do we help raise our sons into men?
Robert Bly had a great quote about this. He says, the woman can turn the embryo into a boy, but it takes a man to turn a boy into a man. Like what you can do as a mother, as a single mother, is once a boy reaches a certain age, somewhere between 7, 13, puberty, at the onset of puberty at the latest, you have to commend him into the hands of capable men to teach him. That can be a sports coach. That can be, that can be an uncle or maybe a neighbor or a relative, right? Or a men's group in person, or like Trail Life is a Christian group. But the Manosphere gets the number of things right, but one of them is that women are made, men are grown. A man has to be cultivated, actively cultivated and shaped. The raw material of him has to be shaped into a useful tool. A woman is like the forge and anvil, right? Is the name. One of the most popular metaphors for a man is being forged. And what do you do when you forge something? Well, one of the methods is you take a piece of metal, you stick it into a furnace and get it really hot, and then you hit it really hard, right? That's the forging process. That's what is done to men. The refiner's fire. What's the metaphor most often used for women is like a flower. Flower just opens, right? And so, I could go into our physiology reflects this as well, with, we might say, a sword and a flower and all these things. Like, you can see this reflected in our being. And so a woman can't give that to a man. She can only give that young boy into the hands of more capable men to train that. And that's very difficult for some women to do. And so when you encounter resistance in yourself, if you do as a mother, if you encounter resistance in yourself to letting your boy go be a man and experience pain and hurt and rejection because of your mothering instinct wanting to protect him, you have to withhold that and nail that to the cross and suffer with your son in the same way that Mary released Jesus to his fate, right? It's not documented in the Bible, but if you look at the statue of the Pietà by Michelangelo, you can look it up on the internet. It's Mary holding the dead body of Jesus. Like, this is what a mother must do for her son, is release him into the world to suffer and to be quote unquote crucified. And so that's a woman's unique burden, which many women haven't been discipled in providing, and they have to learn to provide it.
That's great. That's great. We had another one in the chat. Grog said, do you believe there's a lack of biblical critical thinking among Christian men to differentiate between discernment and causing discord when a concern is identified in one's church?
Discernment between... Well, I mean, it's funny. I think I got this question at a recent event I did with Annalise from Feminine Not Feminist. I'll answer it the same way because I'm not sure exactly what he means, but I'll take a shot at it. If you have like, men work in hierarchies, right? And if you have a problem with something that's taking place in your church or in your workplace or in your group of friends, it's important to handle it the right way. It's important to take the concern directly to the involved man and not make a thing of it in your social environment. Like, did you hear such and such is happening? Then if you got a problem with doctrine in the church or preaching in the pulpit, you go to the pastor, you go to one of the elders before you say anything to anyone else. And if you post on whatever Facebook group or whatever, like, I'm concerned that's called concerned trolling. It's an online kind of phenomenon that's used to sow discord in various groups online. Well, I don't have anything productive to say, but I'm just concerned that. Look, if you are concerned, genuinely concerned about something, go and take it directly to the person and don't talk about it online. Don't whisper it. That's gossip. And gossip destroys good churches. So you as a man must take on the risk and the burden of owning your concern and of going to the person involved and face to face and confronting them like a man. Say, Pastor so-and-so, I'm concerned about this, and here's why. Lay out your case, take your notes, bring them there, read them if you got to, and own it. And if you're not willing to do that, don't say a word about it because you're not willing to put in the work, and you're just essentially being lazy. And now look, people do have concerns with doctrine of churches. That is a thing, and that's valid, and that's okay. And that's one of the benefits of being in a Protestant church. Assuming you're Protestant, is that if you have an issue with doctrine being taught from the pulpit, you can go bring it up with the pastor, right?
Right.
Like, love to my Catholic brothers, but like, they're having a real problem holding their church hierarchy accountable. Why? Because they'll lose their salvation. I don't think that's a good position to be in. As Protestants, especially if you're Calvinist, that's not really an option. So you can bring it directly to your pastor, but you have to own it, and you have to be ready to deal with the conflict rather than farming the conflict out to making a social solution out of it. You take it on as a man, and I guarantee you it'll be worth it, but you have to do it in the right way.
Great advice. Well, Will, I want to go ahead and wrap things up here, but first I wanted to have you tell the audience a little bit about your conference that you've been working on, as well as you've got another big project that you're currently funding. So if you can kind of talk about both of those things.
Yeah. So let's talk about the conference first. So I mentioned, so I've been doing the Renaissance of Men Digital Conference series. It's an ongoing series of events that I'm doing online. I had the first one back in March with a number of different speakers, some of whom are quite popular on YouTube, like Will Nolan from Nolan Knows, and Ryan Wisdom from Wisdom Kings, and Nate Spearing. 6 speakers, all day long event on March 25th. Was an awesome success. I had a blast. I've just announced the second one, which is a lineup of all female speakers, 7 all female speakers, talking about biblical femininity, and the Proverbs 31 woman. So some people online in the Manosphere have made a mistake. They think it's women lecturing men. It's not that at all. Like if they knew how to read, they could just click the page and see that it's a conference. But it's under the Renaissance of Men brand because I'm doing the thing. So it's a conference about biblical femininity by women for women. Of course, men are welcome to attend as well. And I'm very, very excited about this event. It features 7 hugely successful creators, including Allison Armstrong, who I mentioned. She's going to be joining me for a 45-minute discussion of one of the Proverb 31 virtues, which is wisdom. And Allison Armstrong has been doing this for 35 years and travels around the world. You have Annalise, Feminine Not Feminist, 180,000 followers on Instagram. Dear Sister, Soli Oli, Bernadine Bluntly, Martine de Luna, and Issa Ryan. So these are all very popular creators on Instagram, especially. So we're going to be doing a full day thing about biblical femininity for women, and I'm very excited. The ticket sales for that are pretty crazy already. So you can find out information about that by going to rennofmen.com/conference. And if you enter the code RENNOFMEN, you can take $5 off. And that'll be on all day on Saturday, June 3rd, from 9 a.m. Pacific to 5:30 p.m. Pacific. 7 talks, and 2 panels. So panel discussions as well. It's going to be a really full day, and I'm excited about it. And the reason why I'm doing it is because there's something very special happening with women exploring femininity. And women are so good at networking and so good at communicating and so good at community that I really believe that if women can just see that other women are doing this and pointing the way towards it, it will bring so many women along, because I think they need to see it modeled. Like, we're trying to do something that's so alien to our mothers and our grandmothers, but we feel it in our hearts. We don't hate men. We want to love men, but we don't know how. We don't know what it looks like. And so here are 7 creators of women that are so excellent at that, who inspire me. And so I really hope that men and women will join us. So you can go to rennofmen.com/conference to buy tickets for that. And then the other, yes, Michaela, it will be live. It's from 9, and then it will be recorded as well and posted later. So the other project I'm working on is a documentary series called The Renaissance of Men. I've been working on this for 3 years. It's what I've been doing behind the scenes as I've been building the Renaissance. So I've had my podcast and my content creation, my men's coaching. Behind the scenes, I've been producing a multi-part documentary series. And I did in 2021, I did a 110-day road trip across the U.S., 14,000 miles, and conducted 25 interviews of all these major leaders of the Renaissance, trying to document this phenomenon. And recently, my podcast guest, Chase, also known as Sovereign Bra, who's been very popular from his appearances on the Whatever podcast, he asked me on a podcast that we did about it. And so I just sent it and said, okay, let's talk about it publicly. So I'm making this information public now. And you can go to my YouTube page, youtube.com/@RennOfMen, and watch the What is the Renaissance video. And you can learn much more about the war on masculinity, which I talked about during this podcast, about the Renaissance of Men and Great Reconciliation. And you can see some of the footage that I recorded and get a much more in-depth view of this. And of course, I have tons more information that I could share about all of this, but the video will give a good overview of where I believe we're at as a civilization. We're just on the cusp of something very, very special. It can be very hard to see, but you can look within yourself and within the hearts of men and women, and you can see it taking shape. And so that is a big part of my faith. It's not my story. This is God's story. I didn't make this up. I saw it happening and I gave it a name and decided that I wanted to go tell people about it. And so you can learn about everything that I've been working towards by watching that video at youtube.com/@RennOfMen.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Will. It's always great having you on. Anything else that you want to shout out before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed all our conversations. I enjoy listening to your live streams as well. And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share some of these things. And I just want to say thanks to all the viewers as well who are watching and listening and for their insightful comments. I believe it's discussions like this and opportunities like this that we can really plant a seed in men and women's hearts about a better future that's happening for all of us if we just have the courage to see it through. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Amen. Always glad having you. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We've been Forge and Anvil, and we will see you next time.